Are we live, baby?
Just this 1 second. It's almost there.
I see the live line.
And good to go.
Are we streaming on YouTube as well?
That's where we're at.
We're on YouTube, baby! Back at it again! Woo! It's another edition. It's the special presentation, NFL Draft Bible, the state of football. I am your host, Rick Saratella, here in New Jersey, along with Ryan Roberts, just a little bit further west towards the Philadelphia border, and of course, John Murphy up in Toronto, where he awaits the CFL destination. And that's what we're here for this week, to provide alternate programming. If you're tired of the mainstream media, if you're tired of watching the NFL Network, Good Morning America, if you're tired of watching ESPN talking about, Tom Brady and the Buccaneers and all this other nonsense, we're going to address the pandemic. We're going to address the trickle-down effect of what all these decisions have. We're going to talk about the state of the CFL. We're going to talk about the state of the NFL. We're going to talk about the state of college football, what it means. Somebody has their audio feedback. What it means, hopefully it's not me, what it means if there's a college football season in the FBS in the fall and the FCS in the spring. How is the NFL calendar going to adapt? What will the draft process look like? What will scouts be allowed to do? On-campus visits, interviews, all-star games. We're going to break it all down. We're going to weigh in. And throughout the week, today's our first show. We're going to be here each and every week, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. We're going to run Monday through Friday here and get you caught up to speed with all the current events, all the hot topics. And I'm really excited about it. We're going to have special guests throughout the week. I know Dane Vandernat, the director at NFL PA Bowl, said he'll join us. David Turner, of course, from the Friday Night Scout School, and of course, veteran NFL scout will join us. We'll have some other special guests. Emery Hunt said he's going to hop on, the football star from a Football Game Plan. And man, I'm sure we're going to have lots of other special guests throughout the week. Also this week, we have Wednesday night, the Brian Baldinger wide receiver seminar. We're going to break down Randy Moss, Devontae Adams, some of the top wide receivers from the past decade. And of course, you heard me talk about Friday Night Scout School with Ryan Roberts here at Rise and Draft. Of course, John is at DraftJM13, and you can follow us at NFL Draft Bible, but they're breaking it down each and every Friday. Suddenly, the NFL Draft Bible has become the hotspot, the go-to destination, the most cost-effective way to enhance your scouting skills. We'll talk more about that, but let's get into some hot topics. Woo! There's the mainstream media special effects. Let's talk about the opt-outs. And today was supposed to be the NFL opt-out deadline. Now I just watched the interview with Jimmy Haslam over the weekend. He's saying, we'll know by August 3rd. August 3rd is the deadline. Now, I'm waiting to talk about all these guys that we're going to see opt out from last night because I thought today was the deadline. Now you're hearing from Pro Football Talk, I think we saw Devin McCourty basically said it's BS. The NFL's reneged on what they said. They're moving the opt-out up. They're moving it back. They want us to commit. Long story short, John, we've seen a slew of guys. God bless the Jets. They trade Jamal Adams, and then C.J. Mosley opts out. Nate Soldier, also here in New Jersey. Andre Smith, Donta Hightower, Starlo Tuloli, Patrick Chung. The list goes on and on. How much different is the NFL going to look when it kicks off, John? And how many more veterans are going to opt out?
Yeah, I think the part that McCourty's definitely dead on is that the more this is happening, the more people probably want to get the window shut. Have it be that they have some knowledge of what their roster is going to look like, and then try to move forward in saying, well, now once we know what we have, how do we keep it as safe as possible, right? Because you could see the issues that they're seeing that Major League Soccer and hockey are not having, the NBA doesn't seem to be having, and every second there's a guy in baseball that's testing positive, and their staff and the coaches and the people in the clubhouse. So obviously, if the NFL is replicating very similar to Major League Baseball, that would be a problem. And I think unfortunately, that's pretty much, I think, what a lot of the NFL players are seeing, which is, wait a minute, that's a replica of what we're about to do. And that's what I'm probably walking into, is that if I decide I want to play in the NFL this year, there is a likelihood that I'm either contracting it, being around it, or at least subject to a much higher possibility than these other sports, because we're all going to have to be fundamentally in a similar building. There is going to be travel. We're not playing neutral site games. And that's going to lead to some level of likelihood that people are testing, and testing positive, right? Because you read down that list, and that's a pretty long list. And pretty much every team seems to have put multiple people on a COVID type list. And some of those names would make it be a guarantee that, watching a season full of Lions football, as bad as it is much worse if you're playing with your second and third string quarterback. So, there's a lot of do's and don'ts there. There's a lot of, tug of war with those things. And I think it's really the factor that, I understand where Devin McCourty is coming from, and you have to respect, the players' thoughts on that. But in the other sense, these clubs need to kind of have an idea in the realm of saying, like, hey, you don't want NFL games. It's one thing to play baseball and do it with less than major league pitching, or do it fundamentally with what's going to happen with how the Marlins would play 2 weeks without, a handful of starters, or the Cardinals doing it without a couple of players. Playing a physical game like football, and you do it minus 2 or 3 real guys, and that happens, and you don't have time to adjust to it, you're talking about injuries. You're talking about, 30, 40, 50, to whatever type scores. I don't think the NFL wants any part of the competition of the game, to be at risk over not knowing what these rosters look like. Because I think you've seen a couple of teams that are kind of really being shrewd about their moves, that they're adding a couple of veteran guys here and there, and then putting a few of their special team or guys that aren't competing for starting jobs. Those are the guys that they're releasing early, and then might sign a few of those guys back. But, like the last few signings you've seen, with the Bills adding a D tackle and a DB that have played in the league, the Saints signing Nigel Bradham when they knew Kiko Alonso was not going to be ready for camp. Those teams that are playoff bound in their mind are making some shrewd moves. And I think the NFL in general wants to ensure that the level of competition is not at stake over the guys that opt out.
Speaking of moves, right this very morning, PJ Hall, former second-round pick, being released by the Raiders, previous regime there. You talked about the injuries, John. At what point Nate Soldier opts out? At what point, how many offensive linemen does it take to get COVID until David Gettleman says, hey, guess what, Danny Jones, you're not playing this week. We ain't playing behind that offensive line. And, you've heard talk now that some teams are actually going to have a quarantine QB. They might not even be actually signed to the team. But it's like, hey, Matt Moore, go stay in this hotel room over here. And if our QB room gets infected, guess what? You're on call. We're going to sign you up. You study the film room. You study the playbook. Be ready to go. The quarantine quarterback might be the most important position this year. And then a couple other things before I toss it to Ryan. You mentioned baseball, the Marlins, 18 players, 1 coach. Now there's a player from the Marlins. He has long-term effects, heart condition from having the COVID. I think 1 or 2 Marlins players now have opted out of the season. How many players are going to see that and say, hey, you know what? I'm good, Ryan.
I mean, it's a tough conversation, kind of like what John was talking about, right? There's so many different sides to it. You look at it from the team perspective, team building. There is an uncertainty, not only with these players, but also just the general course of what COVID is going to bring to us, right? So we're kind of trying to manage that. We're trying to manage from a player's perspective, what's the best individual case for me, right? We've seen a lot of guys that have had past, illnesses or things in their family that they don't want to jeopardize anything from a family perspective. But then it's a business side of things, and I understand that to a complete degree. But I think the biggest question mark now is going to be, is there a point where the quality of the football that we're going to see on a week-to-week basis is high enough that it makes sense to continue with this season? I think that's the biggest question mark for me. And you mentioned baseball right now. Like, is baseball going to last? I seriously doubt it. That one is like, I mean, I've been a couple weeks into that one, you know, ever since they were trying to negotiate everything. I didn't see the staying power with that. Now, football obviously is king in the U.S., right? It's the number one American sport by a landslide. But are you going to sacrifice the high quality just to put a product on the field? I think that's the biggest question mark for me right now.
Well, and it all points back to the dollar signs, because the $9 billion in TV deals and streaming rights kicks in immediately as they kick off the season. So even without one ticket sale, without one beer sale, without one merchandise sale, the NFL owners are going to collect $450 million in their pockets. And that's what's driving this train. So, you know, any final thoughts here, John, before we move on in terms of, you know, I also saw Doug Peterson test positive for COVID. Now, here's a team that won't have their head coach be able to be in the facility. Luckily, they have a future head coach in waiting in Deuce Staley, in my opinion. But what happens 2-3 weeks from now, John, when they're preparing for their first game? And, oh, by the way, our head coach, he's on quarantine. He might not be around the next month.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you were saying about the quarantine quarterback may take shape in a larger capacity to say, even if you have the right or the ability, you know, to host meetings or to do workouts in a certain way, that, you know, the teams that are going to survive, or a team that could thrive in this scenario, may be one that thinks outside the box and limits their experiences in that capacity, and, you know, limits down to doing a lot of work individually and having their players, if you're in your room, still doing the meetings, you know, from your room, and limit the number of times that you're in a group setting, you know, and how many of those teams that are able to get their testing method sort of down so that there's not a lot of waiting around. There's, you know, if you can go door to door and do it, you know, and make sure your guys are sticking to the game plan, you know, it's going to be, you know, not only survival of the fittest, but, you know, who can survive doing this in such an awkward, different way, when you know that all athletes, including football players, you know, they have a set way of wanting to do things, a set regiment about how they want to go about their day. Coaches are exactly the same way. They have a way of doing things and a way they want to communicate. And will they be able to say, like, hey, we're going to be able to do a Zoom, you know, call every morning, or we're going to be able to do a Zoom call at night and go over, you know, stuff. And our guys going to be willing to accept, you know, that stuff, and accept doing, you know, way more of this stuff in a very, very different way. But one, if you do it correctly, then maybe there is a chance, you know, that football can do the optics very different than baseball. If you were keeping these guys in a hotel or dorm, they're all divided out. You put one quarterback on each floor. You don't ever have all these coaches in the same room, you know, and things, you know, like we've had a joking conversation about if we were stuck in this environment and stuff, we'd probably literally be like rolling our depth chart board down the coach's hallway. And as it went past your room, you look at it, take a picture of it, and keep sliding it down the hall. And, you know, you put it in one room, and now we could do what we're doing right here and limit the factor that, you know, if Ryan set it up, he's in the room, but he's doing it with his mask on, the board's up, he turns the computer toward the board, and then like each one of us is taking our turn individually going in the room. Everybody else is on the video, right? I mean, and you would be able to interact with the board and let the coaches and let the coordinators and the GM all do their job, but functionally, none of you are ever in the whole room together. And that's probably plausible to say that, you know, that would be a lot of the stuff you'd have to do. And maybe you're having to put literally the head coach, you know, in a box by himself, you know, and does that guy have to, you know, coach from, you know, sort of that box, right? If they're going to have media coverage, and if they're going to have, you know, these games televised and live streamed, it means at some point, those media people and anybody going in there they're going to get tested, have to come in a different entrance, to the facility, have to use a similar or different elevator. I mean, and we've all been at NFL and college games. The mad dash at halftime and the mad dash in the last 5 minutes of a game, you're all using that same elevators. How is that going to work? And how are you able to disinfect or, keep it safe, for, a commingling of people that are one press box, sort of away from each other, but, they're all in a common area at a certain point, whether it's to get to those, boxes or the restroom or the media area, or different things. And, you got to think about things, the headsets, all the things that go into what it takes to do a football game are conducive to issues.
And before I forget this thought, the experience factor comes back into play, because now where teams were actually relying on the younger scouts to just go in and be information gatherers, suddenly, guess what? The pro liaison doesn't have time to call back 300 scouts. The veteran scouts with the relationships over the years are going to have that preference. Same thing in the media. You think all these media guys are going to be invited to the press box? No way, Jose. It's going to be a lot more restricted. And I don't think this is a temporary thing. I think the whole media access thing is going to be a permanent move forward. The schools already don't want to allow all these people around. So there's going to be limited access to the media, limited access to the scouts, and we'll get more into that. But, we talked about the bubble. The Ravens, I read, have actually rented out the top 4 floors of the hotel for their training camp. And I guess about 50% of the veterans are all in for the training camp, said, hey, I'm in, let's see how it goes, and we'll go from there type of thing. But I think that what you mentioned, John, is even though you're all in the same building, you're still not allowed to have a meeting with more than 20 players in a room. So even if the head coach does want to address, Doug Peterson in a way is not in a much different scenario if he wanted to address his team, because they're still, like I spoke to one team, they're installing the cameras in the positional rooms so that when they have a team meeting, the players are in the positional room with their position coach, but the head coach is speaking to all these different rooms. So right. Technology now has actually become a big time friend, because, by the way, speaking of technology, August 13th, we will have a recruiting analytics technology seminar. If you follow our analytics on Twitter, you've seen some really cool technology. Our host, Ryan Roberts here, will bring that to you August 13th, 9 p.m. It's a free Zoom seminar on some game-changing technology. If you want to be a part of that, RIC@NFLDraftBible.com. Just email me. I'll get you in there. But the technology aspect, being able to do the Zoom meetings. And now one thing that Kevin Stefanowski is doing, Ryan, in Cleveland, is he said, hey, we're going to go no huddle for all of training camp. We're going to go no huddle. And that was something that the XFL was doing. No huddle. His philosophy is, if the whole league adapts to going no huddle, that's 100 fewer gatherings per game on average, 50 offensive snaps on each team. It's 100 times throughout the course of the game that we have to meet and huddle up, right? That's his philosophy. Now, I thought it was interesting, the XFL, what they were going to do in year 2, the NFL has communication to just the quarterbacks. The XFL actually did have the communication to the skill positions this past season. Now, in the NFL, the communication gets cut 15 seconds before the play. The XFL was going to do away with that. They were just going to have full communication leading up to the snap. Ryan, in your opinion, is that something the NFL should explore?
I mean, at least for short term, I think it makes total sense. Again, the amount of huddling up, the amount of physical contact potentially in a more, at a higher volume of plays. It totally makes sense from a short term. Long term, I mean, I'm kind of old fashioned a little bit. I like I like a quarterback going up to the line of scrimmage and making some decisions himself. I totally get the conversation, with the coach being able to change things right up into the snap of the football. So I guess I'm just a little old fashioned when it comes to that. But I think that when we're talking about just the health aspects with the COVID-19 moving forward. I think that is going to be a long-term solution potentially, just because, like you said, the no huddle, I think, is going to become more prevalent because of those types of issues. But it's just kind of the old-fashioned person in me that's kind of saying, like, man, I want the quarterback to have some control. You know, I want to see what the center can make the calls at the line of scrimmage. I don't want to lose that essence, but I think for the situation that we're in, it definitely makes sense right now.
And I do know defensive tackle, I believe, is the position that has had the most NFL players opt out, John. And I think a lot of that is because they're in the trenches. They're constantly in that trench warfare. In a way, I'm kind of laughing because, hey, we're not going to huddle, but then go out there and line up and smash heads. And, hey, we're going to be okay there.
Well, I think two things. You might also see a lot of, if you don't want to go to the no huddle, well, then get used to seeing a whole bunch of emojis and, you know, and signs, you know, a lot of Oregon-esque, you know, signs, you know, and stuff. So Chip Kelly, you know, once again, will come circling back around, you know, with ideas, because you could see them trying to manipulate some of that, you know, and work on less verbiage and more signaling, you know, things that could be on wrist. You know, you might see more players with the wristband, you know, on, which has always been a no, you know, with things, you know, stuff that coaches don't want it on the field, don't want somebody possibly losing something, you know, and such. So I think the signaling and how you could get your plays out there, you could probably see that. I just don't see that every coach or every system's going to want that sped up system. And I also think that a lot of the other stuff in terms of when you see who and the type of guys that are opting out, I think some of it obviously can be traced back to people having, you know, family situations, whether it's young families, having a kid, just having a kid, about to have a kid, have an older parent, you know, that they don't want to be a year, or, you know, they don't want to be the next 6 months not interacting, you know, with that aspect of things. But also when you look at these things, you know, and all jokes aside, you know, O-line, D-linemen, when they're in the heart of playing pro sports, would probably lean in the direction towards being in a higher risk category, right? Because you would have to say that, you know, a 180-pound guy getting this, and it possibly has something to do with your breathing and, you know, and all of that. You know, a 350-pound dude, probably not something, you know, that goes away as easily. And like you mentioned, you know, the Red Sox just had a guy opt out, not because of still having issues with it, but suffering an after effect temporarily. And they just said, hey, you know, doing pro sports and trying to get, you know, your heart, you know, rate up that high would not be a smart thing for him to do. And he's having to opt out for the year. And you're talking about one of their top 2 or 3, you know, pitchers in their organization having to opt out for a secondary reason. And that's a baseball pitcher who is in probably a different kind of shape in terms of cardiovascular and all different things than a 300+ pound, you know, lineman. So I think a lot of the guys you're seeing do that, you know, their optics are very different. You know, do we think a lot of younger players? Now, on the flip side, you know, we've talked about the competition, and Lord knows that's a big thing that I would be, you know, thinking of individually, you know, or collectively from this type of role with a team. But I also think it gives you the optic to say a lot of young players are going to take advantage of those opportunities, you know, and a lot of young guys are going to, you know, get jobs that they wouldn't have gotten before. An extended practice roster is going to lead to more things like that. Is there a chance that, you know, we talk about the Tom Brady's, but, you know, when you're talking about veteran quarterbacks, you know, if you're Daniel Jones, you still need all those snaps in practice. You know, that's one thing. However, if you're in a different scenario, will this lead to the backup quarterback now getting a lot more snaps in practice? Because now not only is he one injury away in one sense, he's now one injury or COVID away from not playing. Will you see backup and second and third string players getting a lot more practice? And the idea that you gave NFL teams the option to keep 80 or 90 all the way until you started padded practices, but give them the idea of, hey, like maybe you're going to hold a team A practice, and that's your starters and the few guys competing to be starters. And on field 2 is going to be your 2s and your 3s and your 4s. Well, you're creating some social distance on the practice field. Are there going to be teams that decide to do less team reps? Are there going to be people doing less one-on-ones? Are they going to try to work on themselves and not worry about the competition, as much? I mean, you see the Chiefs were one of the clubs that I saw doing a ton of that work in training camp last year, where, like I said, to be running that style offense at the speed that they do it at, and to not have the massive turnovers and penalties that you would think would be associated with that, that'll be really interesting to see. Can you keep that up if they were having interchangeable parts in football because you were losing somebody to COVID, because you're practicing and doing things differently? The injuries and the COVID, it's terrible with happening in baseball, but the other side you got to look at is there's nearly a guy every other day that's going on the injured list in baseball. And does that have to do with the shortened training camp, the restart, how you're doing things? So I think football has a very good idea in terms of, we can argue when you should allow guys to opt in and opt out. But the one thing I think the NFL has done a very smart move is their return to play, in the sense of they're not doing padded practices for 2 weeks. So you're getting kind of a little more time to roll into things. Probably will save a lot of those soft tissue and nagging injuries from happening earlier in camp. But I think it'll be very interesting to see if you notice and see on whatever film they share with us from practices, leading up to the regular season, how much are they allowed to do and how much do they keep kind of their A guys and their B and C guys separate, from each other to protect that stuff. And then I think the other really interesting thing was that they have said, hey, once we're in our own facilities, the way we may go about replacing injured players, the way we may go about giving guys on the practice roster a little more leg room, right? A little more, length to their evaluation. That'll be the same thing. I think in terms of when you're asking about clubs with their GMs and their coaching staff and their scouts, how you're doing your evaluations this year, both from the pro side and the college side. I think a lot of it will come down to like that vibe, right? That the feel of watching a guy in a game or watching a guy in the preseason and being able to say like, hey, I've seen that before, or I can notice certain traits about a guy on college film. That's going to take a lot, a lot of it's going to now move away from, where the electronics and the technology will help on one side. If you're having to make gut choices and decisions on guys, that's going to be really interesting to see if some of those younger people on those staffs have the experience or, kind of have that ability to use that gut feeling to say, hey, I'm telling you, I think we should stick with this guy over this guy, when you're not going to have as much to go off of that evaluation to stand on the table for somebody.
And, we've heard all this opt out, 350,000 with the legit clause, 150,000 if you just want to opt out. I haven't heard anything about coaching opt-outs, and I think it'll be interesting from my perspective to see how it's worded or structured. If a player or coach, one of their family members is diagnosed with cancer, or somebody's wife becomes pregnant during the season, are they allowed to opt out? I'll say this one final point because I do want to get on to some college football. The worst case scenario here for the NFL, John was talking about the big O lineman, the big D lineman, the big 350-pound guys. The worst case scenario is you have somebody with a undiagnosed pre-existing condition, say, for example, a Corey Stringer, that they don't know they're walking around with some kind of heart condition. They contract the COVID. I don't care if they sign a waiver or not. Not only is that a major, massive lawsuit, that's the end of the season. It's over. One death, it's over. And when you put it that way, that's the severity of the issue that we're dealing with. Now, we're going to shift gears. We're going to flip it and reverse it. We're going to go over to the college football scene. But before we do, let me tell you, the NFL Draft Bible never before has ever publish their year-round draft guide. We've actually put together a year-round NFL draft publication so you have access to it as we build it. As Ryan grinds the film in the film room over there in Burlington, New Jersey, and uploads these scouting reports, you have full access to it. So when we wind up with 682 last year, we're going to smash that in the publication this year. When you go all access, NFLDraftBible.com, and you sign up all access, not only will you get the hard copy publication, you'll get the PDF, but you also get instant access to our year-round virtual draft guide. We've got about 200 scouting reports up there right now already. It's only August 3rd. And I'll tell you what, we mentioned the scouting seminars. This week, Wednesday night, Brian Baldinger, the wide receiver seminars, breaking down Randy Moss and Devontae Adams and others. We've got the Friday night scout school. Ryan, what are you diving into this week?
So we're actually starting the real film work. The last couple weeks have been schemes defensively. You know, we went over 4-3, 4-2-5, 3-4 this past week. So we're really getting into some film work, talking interior defensive linemen. We have, from a college perspective, I have some DeForest Buckner waiting for you guys. I got some Kenny Clark coming out of UCLA. Got Quentin Williams last year coming out of Alabama. There's a lot of great interior defensive linemen we're going to take a look at that to show you what it's supposed to look like, right? We're going to take a look at some former first-round picks to know what our eyes are supposed to be seeing at different positions. We have Buckner playing 3-4 defensive end. We have Kenny Clark playing nose tackle. We have Quentin Williams playing more of a 3-tech role in Alabama's defense. So taking a look at different positions on the interior, seeing how it's going to look for when we get into the real work. The guys coming out this year, we're going to take a look at them, and it's going to give us a good understanding of what they are supposed to look like at the positions. We've seen these guys come out in recent years and be super successful.
And again, that's with David Turner, longtime NFL scout, 5 different NFL organizations, director of personnel for the UFL Hartford, GM, I think Arizona Rattlers, 3-time back-to-back champions there. So a lot of great knowledge. And I'll tell you what, you sign up for the season pass, either Baldy's Breakdown, there's 7 more seminars, or the Friday Night Scout School, which is 22 seminars between now and the end of the year. If you sign up for the season pass, it comes out to about $25 a class. Believe me, no offense, Scouting Academy, Sports Management Worldwide, you will not get anywhere near the education that you receive here for the cost. And as a bonus, we're going to throw in that all-access membership I just talked about. You sign up for one of the season passes, we'll give you the VIP all-access on the NFLDraftBible.com, another $100 bonus right there. So, hey, support the cause. We're an independent scouting service. Nobody else is doing what we're doing, so we appreciate all the love and support from the past 18 years. And this guy, John Murphy, has been here from day one throughout it all and seen us grow. Now, let me talk about the latest topic in the college football world, because we talked about will there be an NFL season? Well, the NFL's got money on the table, so we know we're going to power through. Will there be a college football season? Well, hey, the Power 5 conference is heavily invested. And I think the one thing here before I get into this is what people don't talk about enough is schools cannot afford this kind of testing. Maybe the Power 5 can, but remember, if you go full-fledged with football, then the other fall sports also have to play. Those students also have to be tested. It's not just football we're talking about. We're talking about all fall sports. There's very few schools in the country that can afford that kind of testing. Now, what I will say is as we await a decision from these P5 conferences, the players may have started to decide for us. We've seen the restructured schedules in the different conferences, Big Ten, SEC, 10-game conference schedules. Pac-12 has a decision to make, but not so fast, my friend. According to this article here, the Pac-12 has over 400 players that signed this petition asking for, quite frankly, some pretty ludicrous requests. It says here that they want demands for fair treatment, safety regulations, and concerns over racial justice for college athletes. Part of their requests include presidents, commissioners, executives taking a pay cut to help get through the season. They also want 2% of all conference revenue to support low-income Black students. They want part of the revenue to go to social injustice organizations. And, there's a lot of players leading this charge. Again, over 400 players, Ryan. Javon Holland from Oregon's on the list. Joe Tryon from Washington's on the list. And it says here that there's not enough transparency about health risks, no uniformity to ensure we're all safe when we play each other, and no adequate enforcement infrastructure. Is this the beginning of the end for the Pac-12?
Yeah, I think it is. Because like you said, we're seeing a lot of top players in that conference voicing their opinion. You mentioned Holland, and Penei Sewell from Oregon is in that conversation as well, potential top 5 pick next year. So they have the power with the players. If it's not like it's an NFL organization, right, where if a guy chooses to opt out or he chooses, to make his own decisions, that you can bring a player in off the street, a street free agent or a practice squad guy, whatever it might be. If you lose these types of players, that is, you can't just open recruiting back up right this close to the season. It's a tough conversation to have. I think that this is a very bad situation the Pac-12 is going to have to navigate. I think that there's going to be almost impossible to meet them. Hopefully they can meet them somewhat halfway. I don't know what the wiggle room is for these players, though, with these types of demands. So I don't feel good about the Pac-12 right now with everything I'm hearing. That, like you said, there's some stiff demands. I don't know if the Pac-12 is going to have the ability to come halfway, even if they want to come halfway. So tough situation. It's not looking great, to say the least.
John, you hear Ryan say the power is with the players. We rarely hear that. Do you agree or disagree? And also, some of these requests, I applaud the reasons. I just think during a pandemic, some of the things that they're asking for when these schools are already bleeding money to donate certain percentage of revenues and take pay cuts, I don't think I see that happening. How much wiggle room is there going to be? What's the outcome? And again, do you agree with Ryan's assessment?
Well, I think, you definitely, like I said, what you respect is the factor that now here is a group of similar age guys who are seeing what's going on in the world, are seeing that, okay, now it's okay to use your voice, which they are. Now it's okay to speak freely and not think that you have the likelihood of what you would have seen 10 and 20 years ago, when we know what would have been the end result, of this, which would have been the conference steamrolling those 400 guys, and 200 of them would play, 100 of them would get kicked, would transfer or other, and a lot of it would disappear quickly by the sheer force and weight of the machine. And I think the factor that they're saying, well, like, hey, we can just take one wrench and throw it in there kind of blindly, and if it sticks, well, then we clogged up the machine. Well, like, hey, you got a conference that probably they're not thinking this way. If you're playing in the conference, you're not, you're not thinking that it's a conference that's on a downward swing, but, like it or not, they've been on a downward swing since all the controversy, happened at USC. They've been on a downward swing, when the haves have become the have-nots in the conference, and literally, potentially the best team in your conference is a team that came from outside, your conference and has bullied, most of your big boys. For, on the field and in the draft and in a lot of areas, Utah has started to become the staple, of things there. So, but you clearly, it's a conference that, in the history, of college sports, right? There's been a lot of guys that have played in that conference, at UCLA, at Oregon, that have made, in past times when there have been, human rights issues or, world issues out there. You got to remember that, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Walton, think back. That's a conference that, players have never been shy to voice their opinion, of how things were and how things, possibly should be. All the financial stuff, I think that's, I don't want to say pie in the sky, but like when you have to also then have other optics, change to say, okay, that's great, but you can't even put that money on the side and then have eligibility at the moment. They can't promise to pay that to you at a later date, when or if that's agreeable to be doing, that part of things. It's the right idea to try to move things forward, to push the financial button, hoping that they'll give you the other, aspect of things. But, is it likely that a player under scholarship who decides to play, who then tests positive, if he were to, lose his professional aspirations because he ends up not being able to then pass an NFL physical one day, that they're going to open themselves up to, lawsuits like that? Probably not. They'll probably, tell teams to play with what they have. They would probably, make clubs, out there play with the underclassmen or the subsequent leftover players that would be, still there. Will all 400 opt out? When the amount of guys that can make it to the NFL out of that 400, is still a very low percentage. Will those guys stick to this? And will they have any worries of what the after effects would be with the NFL? For them to stand on the table and not play a season, and then know that you're going into your draft potentially 12 to 18 months off the field, and likely not with a place to to stay, because that will put a lot of the schools in an interesting scenario to say, if you let them opt out but remain on campus and everything else, how will all that play out, right? Where you've seen it with these teams, but you're opting out and then you're gone, right? You're not opting out in pro sports and then still around the team. You're going home and you have the comfort of your money. And just so you realize, the opt out in the NFL at least is you're getting that money, but it's then paid back. So if you get that 350 or 150, you're getting it.
It's an
But
advance.
basically it's then coming off of your future salary, in the coming years. And so I think in college, to say what will happen with those students in terms of you opt out, are they allowing you to stay on scholarship? If you opted out, are you then out? Are they allowing you to stay on scholarship? Are they allowing you to stay on scholarship and use, the facilities to continue training and working out, towards, your future career? Again, like I said, if even if it was 400 players and you knew it was the entire draft, of guys for the following year, I'm not sure it would have the impact, that you think, because yes, you're correct. There's not another group of guys to substitute, but there's still guys opting into the transfer portal weekly, daily, and what would prevent all of those guys, if you're going to shut down certain college levels and they're not going to play until the spring or next year, you could have a whole floodload of those guys. For instance, what would would the North Dakota State quarterback go and play, for a major university and put himself, possibly in the talks to be a top 5 or 10 pick by going and playing one season for a major university?
Or might he play in the XFL if the XFL springs around and go make some money?
Right. There is the argument that could be made that, like, hey, there would be options then if they wanted to hardball these guys back and they call their bluff, to say, well, we could go steamroll through the MAC, and the Big Sky, and we could go roll through these other conferences that are delaying their decisions and offer them scholarships to USC and UCLA and Oregon and Utah and things like Colorado, places that have had low or very little cases, and worries, and give a lot of kids that are potential pro athletes opportunities that they may not turn down. So you applaud the idea that the students at their age are willing to, put themselves out there and publicly be named, as well. How much will really come of it would be very, very interesting, because I think the Pac-12 on the flip side, the business side and the ADs, and the presidents of those schools, they now know that the eyes of both the athletes, but the eyes of all the other NCAA members are firmly on them to see how they respond to something like this, both from the human interest side with the players, but also from the fiscal and business side, to say like, hey, if you don't give too much pushback here, you're talking about some end days for a lot of people's jobs.
And that brings me to my final point for today's show. Ryan, to John's point, how much of a trickle effect will this be? Will the SEC still do their own thing? Will this become, hey, Pac-12 is not doing it? I take a look at the Big Ten next, specifically with Rutgers, Michigan State, and I believe Indiana, all currently on quarantine. At what point does the commissioner say, how many teams does it take to have them be on lockdown? And oh, by the way, the Pac-12 ain't going to play. Will this be a trickle-down effect? Can you see some Power 5 conferences still playing in the fall while others opt out or opt to play in the spring?
I mean, I've been on record with this for a few weeks. I mean, Division II, Division III, FCS, I feel like they are, pretty much done at this point. I know some FCS programs will probably try to field their own schedules. We've heard like James Madison talk about that a little bit, Elon. But for like the Power 5 schools, I remain that I think that there is going to be an semblance of football. To what degree, I think is a better conversation to have. To how many teams are going to be in the conference. We're talking about conference-only games. There's a lot of things that are going to get worked out with that. But I do think that the major 5 conferences will still have football this year. It's just to what degree and then in what format it ultimately kind of fits into, I think is the biggest question for me.
And we'll dive deeper into some of these topics. And, Virginia Tech corner Caleb Farley already opted out. What will the trickle-down effect be there? We'll talk about more if the Pac-12 were to get a candidate. Ryan mentioned Penei Sewell, top 5 pick. Some of these other guys, day 1, day 2 prospects. How much does that have a trickle-down effect? In fact, John's still up in Toronto waiting to see what's going to go on with the CFL season. Government bailout. Will there get a deal done? Will it be a shortened season? We'll get some inside perspective more on him there. Little tease, guys, here. We got a couple minutes. Ryan, give me a topic you're interested in breaking down some of the things. We've got 4 more days of going live. What's one of the things that you're excited to kind of dig a little bit deeper into?
Well, I think there's so many sides to it that we really, I really want to touch base on. But I think the scouting side of everything with, lack of campus visits and how it's going to change just the scouting world, changing certain scouting departments. Obviously, I know there's, different teams function in very different capacities and size of scouting departments. I really want to take a look at that because I feel like a lot of people just think of the college scouting perspective, but John mentioned a little bit, right? The pro scouting side of everything, evaluating your roster talent, other roster talent. I want to really kind of dig into how, from a scouting perspective, that COVID-19 and everything as far as the college landscape is going to affect that on a day-to-day basis, a season basis, just everything kind of structurally around that.
And to that point, I'm curious to see if NFL teams will be like the high school model. Hey, I'll trade my practice film for your practice film so we can evaluate those, tier 2 fringe guys. That'll be interesting to see. John, of course, we didn't get to any kind of moving and shaking off-season winners and losers, trades and Jamal Adams type of things. Of course, we'll get to that throughout the week. We wanted to set the baseline for some really heavy-hitting topics that we're going to discuss, again, every week, 9 a.m. Eastern here on YouTube, / All Access Football. What's a topic, John, you're looking forward to digging into a little bit more?
Yeah, I think, taking right off of Ryan's point and what you just said, now you see it's kind of been a 50-50 split, right? Those cuts are not all the rookies like people expected. A lot of teams are getting, are putting some guys on the street that are the 3rd team guy, that's a special teamer that still could probably bounce back at a later date and come back on their roster. when you don't have the media covering it the same way, and you don't have video available every day, and you don't have the fans out there, it means that guy that would be flashing, that guy that they would be saying play of the day or rookie of the day or any of that stuff, there's none of that out there. The first 2 preseason games, there's none of that out there, for that information to make headlines. So I think it'll be interesting to see if you broke down the rosters to say, okay, now who could be a guy on somebody's roster who makes a difference this year? Now, where are there some new competitions? Because, where's the competitions now with New England, with those opt-outs? Where, who's, now filling in? Jordan Phillips leaves Buffalo and Startu Lulule, opts out. Okay, now you're talking about your 2 most productive, guys up front are now gone, from that team. So the same way you've seen a couple of interesting things in the first week of baseball, right? If you shut down baseball today and you start the playoffs, somehow the Orioles are in the playoffs at 5-3, can that last for a whole season? Is there some teams now that could make headway to say, does this allow the Dolphins a thought that things could be better, this year? If a couple of other guys, opt out in certain conferences or divisions, does that start changing the element of things the way you mentioned? You have the Giants affected possibly with their offensive line. Eagles are affected by possibly a head coach. Redskins having now, can you have a quarterback, sort of battle between Alex Smith and Haskins? And how do the Cowboys reverberate off of not getting a contract done for Dak? Well, suddenly every team in that division has its own issue to deal with while dealing with what it's going to be like to do training camp and a season in the COVID world. Could one of these younger teams, and he's a favorite of yours for sure, and we'll see how he does as a head coach in the NFL, Matt Rule in Carolina, when Carolina is already doing things differently than everyone else in terms of how they're setting their guys up, and they're making use of the Zoom and Skype and all kinds of, things like that. And he brought a lot of his own people in there. Could that be a rallying cry? Could a young team with less distractions and less family stuff and less wives and babies and all that type of stuff going on in their world, could they gel to where a year or 2 down the road, you're looking back and saying, wow, amazingly, the Panthers are one of the teams that kind of thrived through the COVID stuff and use a lot of what's happening, just like we saw with the draft last year. Right now, all of a sudden, every sport you're watching, the NBA, NHL, Major League Soccer, they're using that same draft board of the fans behind the scenes like they did. We saw it on draft night. Now we see it in every sport live that we're watching. There's probably going to be some stuff that, as old school as everybody, wants to be, that eventually we'll even get, Ryan to enjoy the no huddle.
There you have it. And I'll just say this, if you're not familiar with what John is referencing, instead of having a locker, the Panthers players actually have their own luxury box as their locker, essentially. So every player has their own luxury suite with the open air kind of set up to, try to combat the COVID. And it's going to be that outside the box thinking that, hey, this is where coaching matters, right? And we'll talk more about that. Other solutions in the marketplace, for example, what Marvin Jones is doing with the free agent database has been amazing for some of these street free agents. We've already had a handful of NFL teams ask and request follow-up, more film on some guys. We've already had 2021 prospects reach out to us to be listed in the database. And we're going to do that for them because they're not going to have a fall season, especially these small school guys. So if you're a player right now and you want to get in that database, hey, if you're 2021 draft eligible, we're going to do that for you. We're working on doing combines around not just the country, overseas. NFL Draft Bible's going to be in London in May of 2021. We're going to be all over the country in 2020 and into 2021 doing combines and showcases and providing avenues and outlets and opportunities because we're forward thinkers here. We're not going to dwell on what we can't do. We're not going to dwell on what's been taken away from us. What we're going to do is focus on how to create new opportunities, how to be prepared for when those opportunities, when they arise, to pounce on that opportunity. And of course, shout out to @MarvinJonesJets. John again is @DraftJM13. Ryan Roberts is @RiseAndDraft. I'm @Rick Saratella, of course, @NFL Draft Bible. Gets you all-inclusive coverage, our seminars, our draft publication, our consulting services, our combines, our database. It's a can't stop, won't stop situation. In fact, we haven't stopped since the NFL draft. In fact, we'll be right back here tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eastern time. So Ryan, cue up the outro. Knock 'em dead, baby. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.